As I sit here in my quaint suburban home, nestled in the heart of a small American town where everyone knows everyone else, I can't help but reflect on the unexpected turn my life has taken. My name is Lisa Turner, and for 35 years, I've lived what most would consider a picture-perfect existence. I'm married to a wonderful man, have 2 beautiful children, and our house is the epitome of the American dream, complete with a white picket fence and a perfectly manicured lawn. From the outside looking in, my life appears to be the very definition of domestic bliss. I've always prided myself on being the kind of wife and mother that others in our tight-knit community look up to, the one who seems to have it all together. But lately, I've been grappling with a growing sense of restlessness, a nagging feeling that there must be more to life than the endless cycle of household chores, PTA meetings, and family dinners. Don't get me wrong, I love my family with all my heart, and I wouldn't trade them for anything in the world. It's just that somewhere along the way, I seem to have lost a part of myself, a part that yearns for excitement, passion, and the thrill of the unknown. I've tried to shake off these feelings, telling myself that I should be grateful for the life I have. After all, isn't this what I've always wanted? A loving husband, healthy children, a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood. These are the things that so many people dream of. And yet, I can't silence the whisper in the back of my mind that keeps asking, is this all there is? It was on a crisp autumn morning, as I was hanging laundry in the backyard, that I first noticed him. Brian Sullivan, the 21-year-old son of our neighbor Andrew. I'd seen him around before, of course, in a town this small. It's hard not to know everyone. But something was different that day. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught his tousled hair, or the easy smile he flashed as he waved hello. Whatever it was, I felt a flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. From that moment on, it seemed like Brian was everywhere. I'd bump into him at the local grocery store, our carts colliding as we reached for the same box of cereal. We'd cross paths at the park, where I'd be watching my kids play while he jogged by, his athletic form catching my eye despite my best efforts to look away. Each encounter, no matter how brief, left me feeling flustered and oddly exhilarated. At first, I tried to brush it off as a harmless crush, a silly infatuation that would pass with time. After all, I was old enough to be his mother. The very thought of anything more was preposterous. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward to our chance meetings, my heart racing every time I caught a glimpse of him. It wasn't long before I started to notice the subtle changes in Brian's behavior, too. His smile seemed to linger a bit longer when we spoke, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified me. There were moments when our hands would brush accidentally, sending electric shocks through my body that left me breathless. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to help myself. The more time I spent around Brian, the more alive I felt. It was as if he had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for years, a part that craved adventure and passion. In his presence, I wasn't just Lisa Turner, devoted wife and mother. I was a woman with desires and dreams of her own. Of course, I tried to rationalize these feelings. I told myself that it was just a phase, a midlife crisis of sorts that would pass if I just ignored it. I threw myself into my household duties with renewed vigor, determined to be the perfect wife and mother that everyone expected me to be. I volunteered for every school event, hosted dinner parties for our friends, and tried to rekindle the spark in my marriage. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thoughts of Brian from my mind. Even in the quiet moments of the night, as I lay beside my sleeping husband, it was Brian's face that filled my dreams. The guilt was overwhelming at times, threatening to consume me. How could I, a respectable married woman, be having these thoughts about a boy barely out of his teens? As the tension between us grew, so did my fear of discovery. Our small town thrived on gossip, and I knew that if anyone were to suspect even a hint of impropriety between Brian and me, it would spread like wildfire. The thought of disappointing my family, of becoming the subject of whispered conversations and disapproving glances, was almost unbearable. And yet, despite the risks, I found myself looking for reasons to be near him. I'd offered to bring over casseroles to Andrew's house, using the excuse of helping out a single father to catch a glimpse of Brian. I'd time my evening walks to coincide with his return from work, my heart skipping a beat every time I saw his car turn onto our street. It was during one of these chance encounters that everything changed. I was walking my dog, enjoying the cool evening air, when Brian pulled up beside me in his car. He offered me a ride home, and against my better judgment I accepted. As we drove the short distance to my house, the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. When he pulled into my driveway, neither of us made a move to get out of the car. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and our own rapid breathing. Then, slowly, Brian turned to me. His eyes, filled with a mixture of desire and uncertainty, met mine. In that instant, I knew that whatever was happening between us was mutual. The realization both thrilled and terrified me. "Lisa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't stop thinking about you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I knew I should leave, should open the car door and run into my house, back to the safety of my normal life. But I remained frozen, caught between the overwhelming urge to reach out and touch him and the paralyzing fear of what that touch might lead to. As I sat there, my mind raced with the potential consequences of my actions. I thought of my husband, my children, my reputation in the community. I thought of the life I had built over the past 15 years, and how easily it could all come crashing down. But I also thought of the emptiness I had been feeling, the longing for something more that had been gnawing at me for months. In that moment, sitting in Brian's car with the weight of my decisions pressing down on me, I realized that I was standing at a crossroads. The choice I made in the next few seconds would irrevocably alter the course of my life. Would I choose the safe, familiar path of my current existence? Or would I take a leap into the unknown, risking everything for the promise of passion and excitement? As I looked into Brian's eyes, I saw a reflection of my own desires and fears. I saw the possibility of a different life, one filled with the kind of passion and intensity one had only dreamed about. But I also saw the potential for heartbreak and devastation, not just for me, but for everyone I loved. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, my decision hanging in the balance. In that moment, I wasn't just Lisa Turner, wife and mother. I was a woman on the brink of a life-altering choice, one that would define not just my future, but the futures of everyone around me. As I took a deep breath, preparing to make my decision, I couldn't help but wonder, was I ready for the consequences of my actions, whatever they might be? As I lay awake in bed, the soft breathing of my husband John beside me, I can't help but feel the weight of my secret pressing down on my chest. It's been weeks since that fateful night in Brian's car, and my life has become a delicate balancing act between the familiar comfort of my family life and the intoxicating thrill of my hidden desires. Every morning, I wake up with a mixture of guilt and excitement, knowing that I'm living a double life that could shatter everything I've built over the years. The attraction I feel towards Brian has only grown stronger with time. It's like a fire that's been smoldering inside me, slowly consuming every rational thought and moral principle I've ever held dear. I find myself constantly thinking about him. His touch, his smile, the way he looks at me as if I'm the only woman in the world. It's a heady feeling, one that makes me feel alive in ways I haven't experienced in years. But with this exhilaration comes an overwhelming sense of guilt. Every time I look at John or my children, I'm reminded of the betrayal I'm committing. I've started to withdraw from them, afraid that they'll see the truth written on my face. I make excuses to spend time alone, claiming headaches or errands that need running. The lies come easier now, each one paving the way for the next, creating a web of deceit that I fear I'll never be able to untangle. Brian, on the other hand, seems to be reveling in our forbidden relationship. I can see the way it boosts his confidence, the way he carries himself with a new air of maturity and sophistication. He's no longer just the carefree young man next door. In my eyes, and I suspect in his own, he's become a man capable of seducing a married woman, of competing with men twice his age. It's a dangerous game we're playing, and I can't help but wonder if he truly understands the stakes involved. To the outside world, our little town remains as peaceful and idyllic as ever. Neighbors still gather for backyard barbecues. Children still play in the streets until dusk, and the local diner still serves the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi. But beneath this tranquil surface, a current of tension is building. I've started to notice curious glances from Mrs. Johnson across the street when Brian's car lingers a little too long in front of our house. Mr. Peterson from 2 doors down seems to watch me more closely when I'm out for my evening walks, which coincidentally often align with Brian's work schedule. These subtle changes in our neighbors' behavior only serve to heighten my paranoia. Every casual conversation at the grocery store or PDA meeting feels like an interrogation. I find myself analyzing every word, every look, wondering if they can see through my carefully constructed facade. The stress of maintaining the secret is taking its toll, leaving me constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound or glance. Despite the risks, despite the guilt and fear, I can't seem to stay away from Brian. Our stolen moments together have become the highlight of my days, a bright spot of passion in the monotony of my suburban existence. The first time we were truly alone together, away from prying eyes and the constraints of public decency, it was like a dam breaking. All the pent-up desire and longing we'd been holding back came rushing out in a torrent of heated kisses and desperate touches. I still remember every detail of that afternoon. The way the sunlight filtered through the curtains of the cheap motel room we'd rented under false names. The roughness of Brian's stubble against my skin as he trailed kisses down my neck. The sound of our ragged breathing, punctuated by the creaking of the old mattress springs. It was reckless, it was wrong. But in those moments, tangled up in Brian's arms, I felt more alive than I had in years. Since then, our encounters have become more frequent, more intense. We've developed a system of coded text messages and secret meeting spots. Every stolen kiss, every illicit touch, feels like a victory against the mundane life I've been living. But it's also a step further away from the woman I used to be, the wife and mother who once prided herself on her integrity and devotion to her family. As our affair deepens, I find myself caught in an impossible situation. On one side is the life I've built with John, our shared history, our children, the comfortable routine we've established over the years. On the other is Brian, representing passion, excitement, and the promise of a life less ordinary. I'm torn between these two worlds, unable to fully commit to either, constantly teetering on the edge of disaster. John, bless his heart, has started to sense that something is off. I catch him watching me sometimes, a puzzled expression on his face, as if he's trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. He's noticed the changes in my behavior, my sudden interest in my appearance, the mysterious phone calls I take in hushed tones, the way I sometimes seem distant and distracted during our family dinners. He's asked me several times if everything is okay, his concern evident in his voice. Each time, I paste on a smile and assure him that I'm fine, just a little stressed from the everyday pressures of life. But I can see the doubt in his eyes, the growing suspicion that there's more to the story than I'm letting on. It's only a matter of time before he starts digging deeper, before he starts asking questions that I won't be able to deflect with vague reassurances and half-truths. The thought of John discovering my infidelity fills me with dread. I imagine the pain and betrayal in his eyes, the devastation it would cause our children, the scandal that would rock our small community. Yet, even as I contemplate the potential consequences of my actions, I can't bring myself to end things with Brian. The pull he has on me is too strong. The allure of our forbidden romance too powerful to resist. In his arms, I'm not just Lisa Turner, devoted wife and mother. I'm a woman desired, a woman capable of passion and spontaneity. It's addictive, this feeling of being truly seen and wanted for who I am, not just for the roles I play in others' lives. As the days pass, I find myself living increasingly in the moment, pushing thoughts of the future to the back of my mind. I tell myself that I'll find a way to end things with Brian before it's too late, that I'll recommit myself to my marriage and my family. But deep down, I know that I'm lying to myself. The truth is, I don't want this to end. Despite the guilt, despite the fear of discovery, despite the potential for heartbreak and ruin, I can't let go of the way Brian makes me feel. Every day is a new challenge, a delicate dance between my two lives. I wake up each morning not knowing if this will be the day that my carefully constructed house of cards comes tumbling down. Will today be the day that John finds a stray text message on my phone? Will a neighbor finally work up the courage to voice their suspicions? Or will Brian, tired of being the other man, demand that I make a choice between him and my family? The uncertainty is both terrifying and exhilarating. It's as if I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping around me, knowing that one small step could send me plummeting into the unknown. Part of me wants to step back, to retreat to the safety of my old life. But another part, a part that grows stronger with each passing day, wants to take that leap, to embrace the fall and see where it takes me. As I lie here in the dark, listening to John's steady breathing, I can't help but wonder how much longer I can keep this up. How much longer before the weight of my secrets becomes too much to bear? How much longer before I'm forced to choose between the life I've built and the life I've discovered I want? The answers to these questions elude me, lost in the tangle of emotions and desires that have become my constant companions. For now, all I can do is close my eyes and try to quiet the storm of thoughts in my mind. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new lies to tell, new moments of passion to steal. And as I drift off to sleep, I find myself both dreading and eagerly anticipating what the future holds, knowing that with each passing day, I'm moving closer to a reckoning that will change my life forever. I should have known it couldn't last forever. The thrill of secrecy, the stolen moments with Brian, the double life I'd been leading, it was all bound to come crashing down eventually. But nothing could have prepared me for the storm that was about to break over my carefully constructed world. Looking back, I can see the signs that John was growing suspicious. The questioning glances, the probing conversations, the way he'd suddenly appear in rooms I thought were empty. It all pointed to a growing unease in my husband's mind. But I was too caught up in the intoxicating rush of my affair with Brian to notice, or perhaps I simply didn't want to see it. It was on a crisp autumn evening that everything fell apart. I told John the first was going to a book club meeting, a lie that had become second nature to me by then. As I slipped out of the house, my heart racing with anticipation of seeing Brian, I didn't notice the familiar car that pulled out of our driveway moments after I left. Brian and I met at our usual spot, a secluded clearing in the woods just outside of town. As we embraced, lost in each other's arms, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and guilt wash over me. But this time, there was something else, a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. I'll never forget the look on John's face when he burst into the clearing. The shock, the pain, the betrayal. It was all there, etched into every line of his face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Brian and I sprang apart, but it was too late. The damage was done. How could you? John's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. How could you do this to us, to our family? I fumbled for words, trying to explain, to justify, but nothing I said could erase the hurt in John's eyes. Brian, for his part, looked like a deer caught in headlights, his youthful bravado crumbling in the face of the very real consequences of our actions. The drive home was silent, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. As soon as we walked through the door, the dam broke. John's quiet disbelief gave way to rage, his voice rising as he demanded answers I couldn't give. I tried to explain my feelings of emptiness, my need for excitement, but my words sounded hollow even to my own ears. I trusted you, John shouted, his face red with anger. I gave you everything, a home, a family, a life. And this is how you repay me, by sleeping with a boy half your age. His words stung, each one a sharp reminder of the magnitude of my betrayal. I wanted to defend myself, to make him understand that it wasn't just about the physical attraction, that Brian had awakened something in me that I thought was long dead. But I knew that nothing I could say would make this right. As the night wore on, our argument grew more heated. John threatened to tell everyone, our friends, our neighbors, Brian's father. The thought of our private drama becoming public spectacle filled me with dread. Our small town thrived on gossip, and I knew that news of my affair would spread like wildfire, destroying not just my reputation but potentially Brian's future as well. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to Brian, hoping he might have some solution, some way to contain the damage we'd done. But Brian, faced with the reality of our situation, began to pull away. He was just 21 after all, barely more than a child himself. The idea of facing his father's disappointment, of being the subject of town gossip, was more than he could bear. "I'm sorry, Lisa," he said when I called him, his voice trembling. "But I can't do this anymore. It's too much. I never meant for it to go this far." His words felt like a physical blow. In that moment, I realized just how much I'd risked, how much I stood to lose. My marriage, my family, my standing in the community, all of it was crumbling around me. And for what? A fleeting romance with a boy who wasn't ready for the consequences of our actions? Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of my life, I agreed to meet Brian one last time. We chose a different spot this time, an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town that we thought would offer us privacy. As I drove there, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe we could find a way to explain everything, to minimize the damage. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to keep our secret. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Brian and I talked in hushed tones, trying to figure out our next move, we didn't notice the figure watching us from the shadows. Old Mr. Henderson, out for his evening walk with his dog, had stumbled upon our clandestine meeting. And in a town like ours, news travels fast. By the time I got home that night, my phone was buzzing with messages. Friends asking if I was okay. Neighbors offering thinly veiled concern that masked their curiosity. It seemed that Mr. Henderson had wasted no time in sharing what he'd seen. And now the whole town was abuzz with the scandal. As I sat in my darkened living room, the weight of my actions finally hitting me full force, I couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so far out of control. I thought about John, probably lying awake in our bed, his world shattered by my betrayal. I thought about our children, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf their lives. And I thought about Brian, likely facing the disappointment and anger of his father. The life I had known, the identity I had carefully crafted over the years, was gone. In its place was chaos, uncertainty, and the bitter taste of regret. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I realized that there was no going back. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and I would have to face the consequences of my choices. In the days that followed, our little town became a hotbed of whispers and sidelong glances. Every trip to the grocery store, every school pickup, became an exercise in enduring silent judgment and not-so-subtle gossip. John and I existed in a state of Cold War, barely speaking except when absolutely necessary. Our children, picking up on the tension, became withdrawn and anxious. Brian, for his part, seemed to vanish from public life. I heard through the grapevine that his father had sent him to stay with relatives in another state, hoping to shield him from the worst of the scandal. But his absence only seemed to fuel the rumors, with wild speculations about our affair growing more outlandish by the day. As I navigated this new reality, I found myself questioning everything. Had the excitement of my affair with Brian been worth the destruction it had wrought? Could I ever rebuild the trust one had shattered, not just with John but with my entire community? And most importantly, who was I now that my carefully constructed facade had been stripped away? The answers to these questions weren't easy to come by. In the quiet moments, when the weight of judgment and disappointment felt overwhelming, I longed for the simplicity of my life before Brian, before the affair, before I had given in to the restlessness that had been gnawing at me for so long. But as the days turned into weeks and the initial shock of the scandal began to fade, I started to see glimmers of hope. Some friends, true friends, reached out with words of support rather than condemnation. My children, resilient in the way that only the young can be, began to adjust to our new normal. And John, though still hurt and angry, agreed to try couples counseling. Slowly, painfully, I began the process of rebuilding, not just my relationships, but my sense of self. I had to confront the parts of myself that had led me down this path, the dissatisfaction and longing that had made me vulnerable to Brian's charms. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the guilt and shame threatened to overwhelm me. But with each small step forward, I felt a little stronger, a little more like the woman I wanted to be rather than the one I had become. As I sit here now, months after that fateful night when everything fell apart, I can't help but reflect on the journey I've been through. The affair with Brian, which had seemed so important, so all-consuming at the time, now feels like a distant dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The excitement and passion have faded, leaving behind only the harsh reality of the pain I caused and the trust one broke. But from the ashes of my old life, something new is emerging. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not what I had imagined for myself all those months ago when I first noticed Brian. But it's real, and it's honest in a way my life hasn't been for a long time. John and I are taking things day by day, slowly rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty and forgiveness. It's not easy, and there are still moments when I see the hurt in his eyes and wonder if we'll ever truly move past this. But we're trying, and that has to count for something. As for Brian, I heard he started college in another state, building a new life far away from the scandal that rocked our small town. Part of me hopes he's learned from this experience, that he understands the consequences of his actions. But another part, a part I'm not proud of, still feels a pang of longing when I think of him. The town, too, is slowly moving on. New scandals have taken the place of mine in the local gossip mill. And while I still catch the occasional whisper or pointed look, it's no longer the all-consuming focus it once was. As for me, I'm learning to live with the choices I've made and the person I've become. I'm not the perfect wife and mother I once pretended to be, but I'm also not the reckless woman who threw everything away for a moment of passion. I'm somewhere in between, flawed, human, but striving to be better. The road ahead is long and uncertain. There will be more challenges, more moments of doubt and regret. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm facing life with my eyes wide open, no longer hiding behind a facade of perfection or losing myself in the thrill of forbidden desire. It's not the happy ending I might have once dreamed of, but it's real. And for now, that's enough. I never imagined my life could unravel so quickly, so completely. One moment, I was Lisa Turner, respected wife and mother, pillar of our small community. The next, I was the subject of hushed whispers and pointed fingers, the woman who dared to step outside the bounds of propriety and decency. The scandal of my affair with Brian, once a closely guarded secret, now spread through our town like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It started with sidelong glances at the grocery store, hushed conversations that would abruptly stop when I approached. Soon, it escalated to outright stares and not-so-subtle murmurs. I could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on me, suffocating me with every step I took outside my home. The town that had once been my haven, where I felt known and respected, had transformed into a hostile environment practically overnight. The worst part was seeing the impact on my family. My children, once popular and well-liked, now found themselves ostracized at school. They didn't understand why their friends were suddenly avoiding them, why parents were pulling their kids away when we walked by. The confusion and hurt in their eyes was almost more than I could bear. I wanted to protect them, to shield them from the consequences of my actions. But I was powerless against the tide of gossip and judgment that had engulfed us. John, my husband, was a shadow of his former self. The betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man I barely recognized. He moved through our house like a ghost, barely speaking, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and rage that made my heart ache. I tried to reach out to him, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but my words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall he'd erected around himself. Things came to a head one afternoon when John confronted Brian directly. I wasn't there to witness it, but from what I heard later, it was a scene straight out of a nightmare. John, fueled by months of pent-up anger and humiliation, lashed out at Brian in the middle of Main Street. Fists flew, insults were hurled, and by the time they were pulled apart, both men were bloodied and bruised. The physical altercation only served to fan the flames of gossip. Now, not only was I the adulterous wife, but I was the cause of public brawls as well. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of disapproving stares, couldn't have a conversation without wondering what vicious rumors were being spread behind my back. But if I thought my situation was bad, it was nothing compared to the devastation wrought upon Andrew, Brian's father. When he learned of his son's involvement in the affair, it was as if something inside him shattered. Andrew had already been struggling to rebuild his life after a difficult divorce, and Brian had been his anchor, his reason for pushing forward. Now, that foundation was crumbling beneath his feet. I'll never forget the day I ran into Andrew at the local diner. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a matter of weeks. His eyes, once kind and understanding, now held a mixture of pain and accusation that made me want to sink into the floor. "How could you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's just a boy. You've ruined him." I had no answer, no justification that could ease the pain I saw etched into every line of his face. As the days wore on, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends I'd known for years now crossed the street to avoid me. Invitations to social events dried up. Even my own parents, shocked and disappointed by my actions, kept their distance. I was adrift in a sea of judgment and condemnation, with no lifeline in sight. Brian, for his part, seemed to be trying to distance himself from the whole situation. I heard through the grapevine that he was planning to leave town, to start fresh somewhere where the weight of our mistakes wouldn't hang so heavily over him. Part of me was relieved. Perhaps if he was gone, things would start to calm down. But another part, a part one wasn't proud of, felt a pang of abandonment. After everything we'd been through, was he really going to just walk away? The tension in our little town reached a fever pitch as weeks turned into months. It seemed like everyone had an opinion on my affair, on my character, on what should happen to me and Brian. Some called for us to be run out of town. Others, a precious few, urged forgiveness and understanding. But mostly, there was just a constant, suffocating blanket of judgment that seemed to permeate every aspect of our lives. Through it all, I watched John closely, worried about how he was coping. He'd always been a proud man, someone who valued his reputation and standing in the community. Now that had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. I could see the toll it was taking on him. The sleepless nights, the weight loss, the haunted look in his eyes. I tried to reach out to him, to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us, but every attempt was met with stony silence or bitter recriminations. It was like watching a man I'd loved for years slowly disappear, replaced by a stranger consumed by pain and anger. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from another day of navigating the minefield our life had become. I was jolted awake by the sound of John's truck starting up in the driveway. Something about the hour, about the way the engine revved, sent a chill down my spine. I rushed to the window, just in time to see his taillights disappearing down the street. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and followed him. As I drove through the quiet streets of our town, a sense of dread began to build in the pit of my stomach. Where was he going? What was he planning to do? I followed him to the old bridge on the outskirts of town, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I pulled up behind his truck, I saw John standing at the edge of the bridge, looking down at the churning waters below. Time seemed to slow down as I approached him. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. "John," I called out, my voice barely audible over the rush of the river below. "Please don't do this." He turned to look at me, and the pain in his eyes nearly brought me to my knees. "I can't do it anymore, Lisa," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't live with the shame, the humiliation. Every time I close my eyes, I see you with him. Every time I walk down the street, I feel their pity, their judgment. I'm not strong enough for this." I took a step closer, my hand outstretched. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry. Please, John. We can get through this. We can start over, go somewhere new. Just please don't do this." For a moment, the world held its breath. I could see the conflict in John's eyes, the battle between despair and hope. Then, slowly, he stepped back from the edge. As he collapsed into my arms, sobbing, I felt a mixture of relief and gut-wrenching guilt wash over me. This man, this good man who I had hurt so deeply, had been brought to the brink by my actions. As we sat there on the cold ground, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The life we had known was gone, shattered beyond repair by my choices and their consequences. But in that moment of raw, painful honesty, there was also a glimmer of something else, the possibility of redemption, of healing. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as we drove home, both of us exhausted and emotionally drained. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be therapy sessions, hard conversations, and the monumental task of rebuilding trust. We would likely have to leave this town, start fresh somewhere where the weight of scandal and judgment didn't hang so heavily over us. But as I looked at John, saw the determination in his eyes beneath the pain and fatigue, I felt a spark of hope. We had been to the edge of the abyss and pulled back. Whatever came next, we would face it together. As we pulled into our driveway, I saw our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, peering out her window at us. For a moment, I felt the old shame and fear rising up. Then, taking a deep breath, I reached out and took John's hand. We walked into our house together, heads held high, ready to face whatever the future might hold. The scandal that had consumed our lives for so long was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and pain. But in that moment, I knew that we had taken the first step towards healing, towards a future that, while different from what we had imagined, held the promise of redemption and renewal. As I closed the door behind us, shutting out the prying eyes and whispered judgments of our neighbors, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time in months, I felt ready to face it. Together, John and I would write the next chapter of our story, one of healing, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. As I stand in the empty living room of what was once my home, surrounded by boxes packed with the remnants of my former life, the weight of my choices bears down on me with crushing force. The house that once echoed with laughter and love now feels cavernous and cold, a stark reminder of everything I've lost. It's been 6 months since the truth about my affair with Brian exploded into the open, and the aftershocks continue to ripple through every aspect of my existence. The day after John's near-tragic decision at the bridge, we woke to find our lawn littered with cruel messages scrawled on paper airplanes. Homewrecker. Cougar. Shame on you. Each one a paper cut to my already bleeding heart. As we stepped outside, the whispers and stares from our neighbors felt like physical blows. Mrs. Thompson, who I'd considered a friend for over a decade, pulled her curtains shut as soon as she saw me. Mr. Jenkins, out walking his dog, crossed the street to avoid us, his face a mask of disgust. I foolishly thought that if we could just weather the initial storm, things would eventually calm down. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that there would be no return to normalcy. Every trip to the grocery store became an exercise in enduring silent judgment and not-so-subtle murmurs. The local diner, where I'd spent countless mornings chatting with friends over coffee, now fell silent when I walked in. Even the park, where I used to take long, peaceful walks, became a gauntlet of disapproving glares and hushed conversations. But the public humiliation, as painful as it was, paled in comparison to the devastation wreaked upon my family. John, despite his moment of vulnerability on the bridge, couldn't move past the betrayal. I watched helplessly as the man I'd loved for 20 years retreated further and further into himself, building walls that I couldn't breach no matter how hard I tried. Our conversations, once filled with warmth and understanding, devolved into tense, monosyllabic exchanges. The distance between us grew until it felt like we were strangers sharing a house rather than husband and wife. When John finally told me he wanted a divorce, it was almost a relief. The tension that had been building between us finally had an outlet, but that relief was short-lived, quickly replaced by a crushing sense of failure and loss. As we sat our children down to break the news, I saw the last vestiges of their innocence crumble before my eyes. My daughter, just 13, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and betrayal that I'll never forget. My son, 2 years younger, simply shut down, retreating into a world of silence that no amount of coaxing could penetrate. In the weeks that followed, I watched helplessly as my children's lives unraveled. They went from being popular, well-adjusted kids to social pariahs overnight. My daughter came home in tears more often than not, her former friends now leading the charge and tormenting her about her slut mom. My son's grades plummeted as he struggled to concentrate in class, the weight of our family's scandal pressing down on his young shoulders. As for Brian, the boy who had seemed so mature, so worldly in the heat of our affair, he crumbled under the pressure of public scrutiny. I heard through the grapevine that he'd tried to explain himself to his father, to make amends for the pain he'd caused. But Andrew Sullivan, once the picture of paternal devotion, couldn't look his son in the eye anymore. The last time I saw Brian, he was loading his belongings into a beat-up car, his eyes hollow and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He left town without a word, leaving behind a wake of destruction that neither of us could have imagined in our most feverish nightmares. Andrew, for his part, became a ghost of his former self. The man who had always been quick with a smile and a helping hand now shuffled through town with his eyes downcast, avoiding contact with anyone who might remind him of a scandal that had torn his family apart. I tried to approach him once, desperate to apologize, to somehow make things right. But the look of raw pain and disgust in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. "Haven't you done enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no answer for him. As the dust began to settle, I found myself utterly alone. My friends, the women I'd shared my deepest secrets with over glasses of wine and plates of cookies, now treated me like a pariah. The community organizations I'd poured my heart into for years quietly asked me to step down from my positions. Even my own parents, shocked and disappointed by my actions, kept their distance. The isolation was suffocating, a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. The town itself seemed to change in the wake of the scandal. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized our little community gave way to an undercurrent of suspicion and judgment. People began to look at their neighbors differently, wondering what secrets might be lurking behind closed doors. The annual town picnic, once a joyous celebration of community spirit, was a tense, awkward affair that year, with people clustering in small groups and casting furtive glances at those around them. As I packed the last of my belongings into boxes, preparing to leave the only home I've known for the past 15 years, I can't help but reflect on the irreparable damage my choices have caused. My marriage, once a source of strength and comfort, lies in ruins. My children, the lights of my life, now look at me with a mixture of hurt and resentment that breaks my heart anew each day. The community that had embraced me for so long now can't wait to see the back of me. I've decided to move to a small apartment in the city, far from the whispers and judgmental stares of my former neighbors. John will keep the house, providing some semblance of stability for our children. We've agreed on joint custody, but I know it will be an uphill battle to rebuild the trust and connection I once shared with my kids. As I take one last look around the empty rooms, memories flood my mind. The corner where we put up the Christmas tree each year, now bare and cold. The kitchen where I taught my daughter to bake cookies, silent and lifeless. The backyard where my son took his first steps, visible through the window but feeling a million miles away. Each memory is a bittersweet reminder of the life I had and the future I've lost. The sound of a car horn outside jolts me back to reality. The moving truck is here, ready to cart away the physical remnants of my life in this town. As I step outside, I see Mrs. Thompson peeking through her curtains again. This time, instead of quickly ducking away, she holds my gaze for a moment. There's no forgiveness in her eyes, but perhaps a glimmer of understanding, or maybe just pity. It's more than I've gotten from anyone in months, and it nearly brings me to tears. Loading the last box into my car, I take a deep breath and look up and down the street one last time. This place that was once my haven, my home, now feels alien and hostile. The manicured lawns and picket fences that once represented the American dream now seem like a facade, hiding the messiness and complexity of real human lives and emotions. As I slide into the driver's seat, a wave of emotions washes over me. Regret, sadness, fear, but also a tiny spark of hope. I know the road ahead will be difficult. Rebuilding my life, my relationships with my children, my sense of self, it all seems like an insurmountable task. But as I start the engine and pull away from the curb, I make a silent promise to myself and to those I've hurt. I will learn from this. I will grow. I will find a way to make amends, even if it takes the rest of my life. The town recedes in my rearview mirror, growing smaller with each passing moment. With it goes the life I once knew, the person I once was. Ahead lies uncertainty, challenges I can't even begin to imagine, but also possibility, a chance, however small, at redemption. As I merge onto the highway, leaving behind the scene of my greatest mistakes and deepest regrets, I feel a mix of terror and exhilaration. The future is a blank page, waiting to be written. And this time, I'm determined to write a story I can be proud of one step at a time. The road stretches out before me, long and winding. I have no idea where it will lead, but for the first time in months, I feel a glimmer of something that might be hope. Whatever comes next, I know one thing for certain. I will never again take for granted the trust and love of those around me. The lessons I've learned have been brutal, but they are etched into my very soul. As I drive towards an uncertain future, I carry with me the weight of my past, but also the determination to be better, to do better, to somehow find a way to heal the wounds I've inflicted on myself and others. The city skyline appears on the horizon, a new chapter waiting to be written. I take a deep breath, grip the steering wheel tighter, and drive on, ready to face whatever comes next. As I sit here in my small city apartment, staring out at the unfamiliar skyline, I can't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that brought me to this point. It's been 2 years since I left behind the wreckage of my life in that small town. 2 years of struggling to rebuild, to understand, and to find some semblance of peace with the choices I made and the consequences that followed. The story of Lisa Turner and Brian Sullivan, once the subject of feverish gossip and moral outrage, has faded into the background of small-town lore. But for those of us who lived it, who were at the center of that maelstrom of desire, betrayal, and regret, the echoes of those events continue to reverberate through our lives in ways both subtle and profound. I often find myself wondering about the others involved in our ill-fated drama. John, my ex-husband, still lives in our old house, I hear. He's raising our children with a quiet dignity that I both admire and envy. The last time I saw him, during a tense exchange of the kids for their weekend visit, I caught a glimpse of gray at his temples that wasn't there before. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by the pain and stress of the past few years. Yet there was also a calmness about him, a strength that I hope he's found in the aftermath of our shared tragedy. My children, now teenagers, are slowly healing, though the scars of our family's implosion are still visible if you know where to look. My daughter, once so open and trusting, now guards her heart fiercely, wary of being hurt again. My son, who retreated into silence in the immediate aftermath, has found his voice again, though it often carries an edge of bitterness that breaks my heart. Our relationships are fragile, built on the shaky foundation of weekly phone calls and monthly visits. Every interaction feels like navigating a minefield, but I'm determined to keep trying, to somehow earn back the trust and love I so carelessly threw away. Brian, I've heard, is living on the West Coast now. A mutual acquaintance told me he's working as a bartender, trying to figure out his life away from the suffocating judgment of our hometown. I wonder if he thinks about those months as often as I do, if he's found a way to reconcile the passion we felt with the destruction we caused. There are days when I'm angry at him, blaming his youthful charm for leading me astray. But in my more honest moments, I know that we were both equally culpable, both driven by a potent mix of desire and discontent that blinded us to the potential consequences of our actions. Andrew Sullivan, Brian's father, is perhaps the most tragic figure in our story. A man who had already weathered the storm of divorce, only to have his world shattered again by the actions of his son and a woman he once considered a friend. I heard through the grapevine that he sold his house and moved to a neighboring town, unable to bear the weight of memories and judgment that clung to every corner of our community. The thought of the pain we caused him, the relationship between father and son that we irreparably damaged, is sometimes more than I can bear. And what of that small town we left behind? From what I've gathered from occasional conversations with the few people who still speak to me, life there has changed in subtle but significant ways. The easy trust and camaraderie that once characterized the community has been replaced by a more guarded approach to neighborly relations. People are more careful about the image they project, more suspicious of what might be happening behind closed doors. The affair between a respected housewife and a young man barely out of his teens shattered the illusion of small-town innocence, exposing the complex and often messy reality of human desires and relationships. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, I naively thought that time would heal all wounds, that eventually the gossip would die down and life would return to normal. But I've come to realize that some events leave an indelible mark on a community psyche. Our affair wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a collective loss of innocence for an entire town. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about desire, fidelity, and the fragility of the relationships we often take for granted. There are days when the weight of guilt and regret threatens to crush me. I look at the life I once had, the loving family, the respect of my community, the sense of belonging, and I'm overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I lost. In my darkest moments, I wonder if it was all worth it. Was that fleeting passion, that temporary escape from the monotony of everyday life, really worth the devastation it caused? But then I remind myself that dwelling on these questions is a luxury I can't afford. The past cannot be changed, no matter how fervently we might wish it. The only path forward is through acceptance, growth, and a commitment to doing better. I've spent countless hours in therapy, trying to understand the underlying dissatisfaction and unmet needs that led me to make such destructive choices. I've had to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, my capacity for selfishness, my willingness to prioritize my own desires over the well-being of those I loved most. This journey of self-discovery and atonement has been painful, but also illuminating. I've come to understand that the roots of my affair went deeper than simple lust or a midlife crisis. They were tied to unresolved issues from my past, to societal expectations about marriage and motherhood that I had internalized without question, to a fundamental disconnection from my own wants and needs. This understanding doesn't excuse my actions, but it has given me a framework for ensuring I never make the same mistakes again. As I navigate this new chapter of my life, I'm acutely aware of the ripple effects of our actions. The choices we make in moments of passion or weakness don't just affect us. They have the power to alter the course of many lives, to reshape the fabric of entire communities. Brian and I, in our reckless pursuit of desire, unleashed forces we couldn't control or even fully comprehend. We exposed the fragility of trust, the complexities of human relationships, and the often blurry lines between right and wrong. Yet, even in the face of all this destruction, I find myself clinging to a fragile hope. Humans have a remarkable capacity for resilience, for forgiveness, for finding meaning in even the most painful experiences. I see it in my children, who despite their hurt, still find it in their hearts to love me. I see it in John, who has found the strength to rebuild his life and provide a stable home for our kids. I even see it in the occasional messages I receive from old acquaintances, tentative olive branches extended across the chasm of hurt and judgment. As I look out at the city lights, so different from the starry skies of my old small town, I'm reminded that life goes on. The world doesn't stop turning because of our mistakes, no matter how catastrophic they might seem. There's a strange comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that even as some doors close forever, new ones open. The story of Lisa and Brian, of a small town rocked by scandal and betrayal, will always be a part of me. It has shaped me in ways I'm still discovering, left scars that may never fully heal. But it doesn't define me, not anymore. I'm more than the sum of my mistakes, more than the subject of salacious gossip or moral cautionary tales. As I prepare for bed, I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me is older, wiser, and infinitely more aware of the complexities of life and love. She carries the weight of her past actions, but also the determination to do better, to be better. In her eyes, I see not just regret, but also hope. Hope for redemption, for forgiveness, for a future where the lessons learned from our greatest mistakes become the foundation for a more authentic, compassionate way of living. Tomorrow I'll wake up and face another day in this new life I'm building. It won't be easy, it never is, but I'll keep moving forward, one step at a time, carrying with me the hard-won wisdom born from the ashes of desire and the aftermath of betrayal. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way to turn this painful chapter of my life into something meaningful, something that can help others navigate the treacherous waters of love, desire, and human frailty. After all, if there's one thing I've learned from this entire ordeal, it's that even in our darkest moments, the potential for growth and transformation is always there, waiting for us to embrace it.